Okay. Linguistic anthropologists are also very interested in what they call a vocal vocabulary, a specialized set of terms and distinctions that are important to certain groups. Now, vocabulary is the area of language that changes the most, right? And when we are small, we generally don't have a whole lot of vocal vocabulary, right? It's as we get older and we have more specialized things that we do with language. For instance, if you're really interested in sports, you probably know a lot of terminology around sports, right? It's just about the start of, I don't know, maybe football season right now. So you could think about what sort of language is used to talk about football or baseball, right? And apply that vocabulary to the rest of the world. Like maybe not everybody who speaks English shares that vocabulary with you because you don't have that specific interest in this particular aspect of our culture. This is part of a way of looking at language attached to how we use it and attached to what groups of people need to be able to communicate with one another about. It's also connected to our ideas about semantics, or a language's meaning system, right? We are very invested in how we use language and what that means about us. Speakers of particular languages use sets of terms to organize their experiences and perceptions. And there's a subcategory of linguistic anthropology called ethnosemantics, which studies the vocabulary category and contrasts across cultures. For instance, kinship terminology, right? If you think about the U.S., we probably use kinship terms to describe who we're related to, like mother, father, sister, brother, aunt, uncle, cousins, right? But those categories are different in different cultural groups. We're going to talk about that a lot more when we get to family, right? But that means that we can compare the way we talk about family and the way we think about family across groups. It's also true of color terminology. Different cultural groups see different numbers of colors and different ways of perceiving color and describing color. There's also some gender differences in talking about culture terminology, even within our own language. For instance, this researcher did a bunch of studies on the ways that women and men describe language, and they would, for instance, say to women, "What color is this sweater that I'm wearing?" And women would come up with these very specific terms around it, like maybe it's rose or dusty pink, or it's pale pink, and then she would ask a group of men, and the men would say pink. Which leads to an interesting conversation about, do men and women in the U.S. have different sets of language terms that they use, right? Could be true. All right. So, which is of course an aspect of sociolinguistics, the relationship between social and linguistic variation, or a language in its social context, like how do men and women use language differently. This focuses on features that vary systematically with social position and situation, like for instance gender in the experience we just used. Linguistic change does not occur in a vacuum, but instead occurs within society. It's part of that big organic body of interconnected parts, like Durkheim says. Okay, so we're also going to talk today about linguistic diversity, where people are shifting the way that they use language and making decisions about what we think about folks and their economic status or their position in society based on the language they use. I'm particularly fascinated by the concept of term code switching, in which people are using language differently depending on who they are speaking to. I use this all the time, and I'm sure that you do too. You talk differently to one another, your fellow students, your peers, than you would necessarily to a professor, right? You would use more formal language. You would perhaps not use a lot of slang or swearing. I think I'm going to skip over this part on gender speech contrasts because we did actually talk about that a little bit. Although I do want to mention that this week we read Tannen's Conversation on the Job, in which she is discussing how men and women communicate differently with one another in the workplace and what kind of assumptions we make about one another's behavior based on that. you'll be writing about this in your discussions this week, so I don't want to get into it a whole bunch, but I would like you to be thinking as you work on that discussion, how might she take her research on men and women's differing communication styles and how it affects the workplace, and think about how that could be used in applied anthropology. Okay, linguistic anthropologists are also looking at language and status position, right? So in different cultural groups, they have different honorifics, terms of respect used to honor the recipients. For instance, things like doctor, professor, or Mr. and Mrs., or Esquire at the end of a lawyer's name, right? Often these are used to point out achieved status, right? Or something that someone individually has done to move themselves up in status within a cultural group. Our author would like us to notice that Americans tend to be much less formal than other nationalities. In Britain, they use a much more highly developed set of honorifics. This is probably also connected to their political history. In Japan, there are several different honorifics depending on where you are in a status hierarchy. And kin terms can also be associated with gradations in rank and familiarity, right? So you would use different language with folks who are closer to you in your kinship structure than with folks that are farther away. This is an example of stratification, where we look at the ways that different groups are perceived with different amounts of power in our culture. For instance, mainstream Americans tend to evaluate the speech of low-status groups negatively and say, for instance, that their particular dialects are not proper English, don't carry enough information, show low education, even though often that's totally untrue. It's just that we have ideas about what these different groups that get put onto language, even though they're really about race or class or economic status. Our speech habits help to determine how others evaluate us, and thus our access to employment and other material resources. Bordeaux said that linguistic practices are symbolic capital, or something that we can turn into something we need, right? That properly trained people convert into economic and social capital. In other words, if we can be taught to speak in a way that the culture values, that is going to turn into more money and more power. A lot of researchers are currently working on African American vernacular English, which you'll find a lot of talk about in non-academic circles as Ebonics, which is a dialect of Standard English rather than a separate language. Now, Standard English is not necessarily any better than any other form of English, but we are talking about sort of newscaster English, right? Like somebody who has a very proper, not proper in a British kind of way, but what we think of as the prestige dialect, the way that we expect basically rich, wealthy, really well-educated people to speak, even though there's lots of dialects all over the U.S. In fact, if you want to have one of those jobs that has a high expectation of standard English, you often end up spending a lot of time changing the way you speak to adapt to that expectation, even if you have like a southern dialect or, for instance, you grew up speaking AAVE, which is a complex linguistic system with its own rules that are slightly different than standard English. However, AAVE has the same ability to convey complex thoughts and carry information as any other dialect of English. There are phonological and grammatical differences between AAVE and Standard English. AAVE speakers are less likely to pronounce the letter R than SE speakers. Now, this is also true of certain kind of New England dialects that are thought of as being very high status. AAVE speakers use copula deletion to eliminate the verb to be from their speech, and that it's important to note, as I said before, that Standard English is not superior in communicating ideas, but it is the prestige dialect in our culture. So often when your parents, of whatever stripe, were trying to get you to talk proper, they were encouraging you to speak Standard English. Linguistic anthropology is also concerned with historical linguistics, the long-term variation of speech, looking at proto-languages and daughter languages, or the way that our languages are connected to one another, often because groups were trading or intermarrying, and thus sharing cultural features, including vocabulary and syntax and grammar from the languages that they were coming in contact with. This includes daughter languages. Languages descend from the same parent language that have been changing separately for hundreds or even thousands of years. Perhaps the best example for us for this would be the Romance languages, in which Spanish and French and English are all descended from Latin, right? They all share cultural grammatical features with Latin, and a lot of our vocabulary has Latin roots. And anthropology is also interested in language loss, when languages disappear. In the first week of class, we watched a little clip from a TED Talk that talked about what happens when folks lose their language and when they end up being one of the few living people that can still speak their language. It's important to note that of the 7,000 remaining languages, more than 20% of them are currently endangered, in that there is not a large enough body of folks speaking that language to keep it alive. So, there we are again, one very quick, although still 25-minute long, micro lecture about this week's material. I look forward to seeing what you all have to discuss in the forums this week, and I hope you're having a really great day. Bye now.